What's new for New Orleans Saints quarterback Jameis Winston and why it could lead to more success in 2022? Tre'Quan Smith is back, what it means for him and the team, and Mock Draft Monday takes a look at another way for the Saints to use those top 4 selections. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into this Monday episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we are free and available on all platforms, including on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays over on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline's got you covered with all of the odds, props, and bets that you need more than ever before. You can find them all over at BetOnline, where the game starts. So I want to kick off today's episode as we get started with the week here. Talk a little bit about Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston met with New Orleans media on Monday and spoke very passionately about the offseason, the sort of the way that everything unfolded over the course of the offseason in terms of his pursuit of landing with the New Orleans Saints, who he mentioned was his desired destination. It was his top spot that he wanted to be in 2022. And he also talked a lot about his relationship with Sean Payton, things like that. But the thing I really want to highlight here was a conversation that he had a couple times over about what's different for him heading into 2022. And one of the big sort of pieces of that he talked about is something that I think will make the New Orleans Saints and Jameis Winston even better going into 2022, depending upon what the system's able to put together, what they're able to put around the players, the team, all of that other stuff, right? There's still a lot of questions to answer, no doubt about that. But in terms of the relationship between Jameis Winston and the playbook, there's a big factor here. And a big factor with all of it is that he's going into 2022 with the understanding that he is the starting quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. And remember, last year, that wasn't the case. Last offseason, he was competing with Taysom Hill the entire offseason. He didn't know that he was going to be the starting quarterback until just about a week before the season began. And then they were, in the midst of traveling and they were displaced because of Hurricane Ida. And so they were in Dallas, but then they were having to play their first home game all the way in Jacksonville up against Green Bay and all these other pieces. And so Jameis really only got about 7-8 weeks of time actually working with Sean Payton as the starting quarterback. Now, as he comes into training camp, and by the way, he mentioned in terms of his injury recovery, of course, he had that ACL tear against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in his 7th start, the Saints Week 8 matchup at home, which Saints still won that game, but that ended up being the season-ending injury for Jameis. He's been focusing on recovering and coming back from all that, and now the expectation is that, and he told New Orleans media that he's ahead of schedule and that he should be back well before training camp begins. So as he walks into training camp, there's no question. There's no mystery. There's no will he, won't he be type questioning. It's Jameis Winston as a starting quarterback for 2022. And that's the expectation that we've had here on the podcast since he signed his contract, right? You see all these NFL draft analysts that we talked about last week who are saying that the Saints aren't set at quarterback going into 2022 and that they should draft a quarterback in the first round and have him start in 2022 as their starting quarterback, which you can draft a quarterback in 2022, but Jameis Winston's very likely your starter. And so that's something that should make a huge difference for him going into 2022. He'll be able to get the offense built around things that he does well. The team will be built around him and what he does well. All of that is super important. And speaking of the team building around him, the second big piece that should make this New Orleans Saints offense better is going to be Michael Thomas. Now, there was no Michael Thomas last year. Sean Payton, Jameis Winston expected to have Michael Thomas last year. That didn't happen. Now, Michael Thomas is expected to be back on the field for 2022, and that is a huge get. That's a huge boost for the New Orleans Saints, who haven't been able to do anything else at wide receiver. Like, everybody that's on the wide receiver roster so far this year was on the wide receiver roster last year. And I know that a lot of folks say that, well, the Saints offense couldn't produce last year because they didn't have Michael Thomas and they had all the injuries. But even with this group, you still have to do more. And getting Michael Thomas back is great. You're still going to have to do more, though. And we'll talk about what the Saints have done so far, what they haven't done yet, but what they should do, at least moving ahead to the draft in a moment. But just when we're talking about the impact on Jameis Winston, especially potentially starting the season without Alvin Kamara for a couple of games, depending upon how the legal proceedings around his altercation in Vegas go. Getting Michael Thomas back is even more important at that point. So I think those two things, Jameis Winston coming in with a clear understanding in the franchise and organization, and offense having a clear understanding that he's the starting quarterback. He's not taking snaps with third, fourth team guys. He's taking snaps with the guys that he's going to play with on Sundays, and getting Michael Thomas back are two big things that should help Jameis Winston be more successful in this New Orleans Saints offense. Here's something else that was talked about that I thought was very interesting. They talked about, Jameis Winston did, the changes in the New Orleans Saints offense with Pete Carmichael at the helm. And one of the things that he mentioned was that you're going to see this offense open up a little bit more than what we really got to see last year. And that has to do with maybe Pete Carmichael just having a different style of play calling, but also we started to see that happening right as Jameis's injury happened in 2021. So I think that's the other piece of it too. You have a little bit more confidence going into 2022 in terms of this is what an offense could look like if it was opened up and he really got in his pocket. So I think if you're able to continue to build the offense around the things that he does well, efficient first and second down is always going to be a big piece of the New Orleans Saints offense. That's not going to go anywhere. But how do you utilize Jameis Winston's skill set of being able to be accurate and push the ball downfield? Remember, 19 of those 30 interceptions that everyone loves to talk about did not happen downfield, right? They happened over the middle of the field, and they happened within, 20 yards or so of the line of scrimmage. So pushing the ball downfield, yeah, there's some high variance there in terms of incomplete versus complete or big play, but it's not necessarily that you're risking everything when you do that. So I think giving him the opportunity to operate in an offense that is efficient on first and second down, but also opens up more opportunities for him downfield is going to be really important. In order for them to do that, though, the New Orleans Saints need a downfield threat. They re-signed Tre'Quan Smith. Does that mean they're done at wide receiver? I'll tell you why the answer is absolutely not as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. But before we turn back to wide receivers, I want to turn back to Built Bar, because I always do. Every day I have a Built Bar, whether it's in the morning before I go to the gym, after my workout, or midday. I'm probably going to go grab one here in a little bit. Y'all can probably already see and hear and know that I am tired. So I'm ready to get me a Built Bar, boost my energy back up a little bit, and get that protein that I need with something that tastes amazing, right? With something that doesn't taste like some type of chalky, like bricky, granular protein bar. Instead, I get something that is covered in 100% chocolate, or I can even go the route of like the Built Puffs, which has protein-infused marshmallows, which are also covered in 100% chocolate. But despite whichever route I go there, I'm still only getting 4 or 5 grams of sugar, 4 or 5 net carbs, while I'm getting my 17 grams of protein. So there's just simply no better way to go about this, honestly. I mean, seriously, if you need a protein bar, why not get one that tastes like a candy bar without carrying the 300 calories, the mad, high counts of sugar, the, dozens of net carbs? You don't have to go that route. You can go the Built Bar route, take care of yourself while you're taking care of yourself. And while you're taking care of them, taste buds as well. So go and check them out for yourself, though. You don't need to just hear about it from me. Go and check it out for yourself, built.com, and use the promo code, all right? LOCKED15, LOCKED15. It's going to give you 15% off of your next order over at built.com. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks so much, as always, for making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we are free and available on all platforms here for you every Monday through Friday. And also don't forget to go and check out that Locked On NFL YouTube page as well. The local experts on the biggest stories around the NFL, giving you everything you need in less than 30 minutes. And keep an eye out, because days 1, 2, and 3 of the NFL draft, we're going to be live from WFAA Studios in Dallas, Texas, bringing you all the live draft coverage that you need. Yes, I will be there as well, but you got to make sure that you go and follow that Locked On NFL YouTube page so that you don't miss it. All right, so we're going to get to our mock draft Monday here in a little bit, using those first 4 selections in the first 3 rounds to see what we can do. We're just going to look at a couple of different iterations to see where the different paths the draft could potentially take you will go, because you never know. But what I want to start off with first is whether or not the signing or the re-signing of Tre'Quan Smith moves the needle for the New Orleans Saints at wide receiver. The answer is no, and I don't think that it's necessarily intended to, or at least it doesn't move the needle the way that you think of moving the needle. What everyone wants from the New Orleans Saints is to go out and sign a big name wide receiver and bring them in. There are still a couple that are on the market, guys like Jarvis Landry, who's reportedly asking for $20 million a year, which Jarvis, it's not happening, fam. I'm sorry. Like, he moved on from his representation, everything here recently. I don't think $20 million a year is going to happen. And I think Christian Kirk just got people's hopes up a little bit. But you've got him. You've got guys like Odell Beckham Jr. as well that are still out there on the market. And while they could very well be options for the New Orleans Saints, that's not necessarily the route that they've gone so far. Now, the guy that we sort of designated here on Locked On Saints, you've heard me talk about him a bunch, that was like the target that would have made the most sense for New Orleans was Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Turns out the Saints were in on him. They lost out on him. He's now a Kansas City Chief. Okay, close the book, move on. So what is it the New Orleans Saints do next? Well, we had heard, and if you've been watching or listening to the show for a while, I told you they were going to do this. It makes perfect sense. They bring back Tre'Quan Smith on a 2-year, $6 million deal, and he could get an additional $4.5 million in terms of incentives on top of that. It's not a big deal. It's not a huge amount of money to dedicate to anybody. It's about what we expected to see here because we've talked about it over and over again. The Saints will very likely bring Tre'Quan Smith back because he knows the system and he's a good blocking wide receiver, but he's not the solution for the Saints at wide receiver. Just a moment ago, we talked about how Michael Thomas changes the offense for the New Orleans Saints. It potentially makes it more successful, but you still have to find somebody else. You still have to find another, let's say, premier receiver that has to go over on that other side. And I don't think that the Saints think that Tre'Quan Smith is that guy. He hasn't been since they drafted him in 2018. So let's pump the brakes a little bit on like the big reactions around how, this signing is bad or X, Y, and Z. This signing is a guy that's going to maybe rotate a little bit at wide receiver 3, along with guys like Marquez Callaway and Deontay Hardy. That's who he's going to be. He's going to be a blocking tight end or a wide receiver that's playing like a blocking tight end in some cases. He's going to be, a guy that they use in maybe some short yardage situations as the third receiver, maybe, if they're not using Marquez Callaway in that way. You've got your number one at Michael Thomas. Your next sort of priority still has to be wide receiver 2, right? Who's going to be that Z wide receiver, that field stretcher, that deep threat? I think personally, at this point, with Will Fuller kind of being the last good deep threat that's out on the market right now, I personally think that the Saints will look to the draft to try to solve that problem. And I know that the Saints don't draft wide receivers very often, right? We saw Kawan Baker, we saw Tre'Quan Smith. Those are the last 2 wide receivers that the Saints are drafted. Tre'Quan Smith was drafted back in 2018, 2017 in the 3rd round. Kawan Baker was drafted last year in the 7th round. So you're not looking at them to come in and have an immediate impact the way that you might look for somebody drafted in the 1st or 2nd round too. But no matter who the Saints draft or where the Saints draft at wide receiver in terms of placement, right, rounds 1 through 7, whoever they draft has to come in and make an immediate impact, right? They have to look for an immediate impact, field stretching, deep threat wide receiver. Those are like the boxes that I'm trying to check off for this team. If I'm the general manager and I'm making that decision, right? And so I think that when you look at what the Saints have done so far at wide receiver, they brought back Deontay Hardy. They're working on bringing back Lil Jordan Humphrey. They brought back Jalen McCleskey. They brought back Tre'Quan Smith. Michael Thomas is expected to get back out onto the field. Mike Clay put out his position rankings for every team over at ESPN across the NFL, and the Saints are like 25th at wide receiver. They have some work to do, and signing Tre'Quan Smith does not move them to 24th. But it also doesn't drop them to 26, right? You're adding somebody that's going to compete for a role 3 through 6 on your roster. That's what you've done with Tre'Quan Smith at this point. Now, it's very likely he'll make the roster because you're paying him a little bit over like a vet minimum, like what you expect Lil Jordan Humphrey will get. But it doesn't mean that you're done. The Saints can't be done. And the Saints should look at development as a real opportunity for them going into the draft because they're bringing in or have brought in a wide receiver coach like Cody Burns. They brought in an offensive assistant like Bicknell, who was the Bengals wide receiver coach who brought upon both of the 1,000-yard seasons that Tyler Boyd had after having an okay season and then an injury-riddled season. Then he went off for 2 straight 1,000-yard seasons, and then they started adding all this other wide receiver talent that started to, tear away at his targets and at his yardage and things like that. So having both of those guys, coaches Bicknell and Coach Burns, that's huge for New Orleans. And we talked about Coach Burns and what he's done. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what Cody Burns has done with wide receivers of Michael Thomas's mold. But honestly, he hasn't done a lot of work with Michael Thomas like receivers. However, Coach Bicknell has. And he's the guy that I'm looking at to see, okay, how can you further develop what Michael Thomas is able to do coming off of an injury, right? Because it doesn't make sense to expect another 149 catch season But with developers like Burns and Bicknell, you're not dropping to 80%, right? You can get up to 90%, 87%, something like that of, that 2019 incredible season that Michael Thomas had. And you'll take that. You'll take that 1,000 times over. Certainly Jameis Winston will. He talked about it a bunch. So when I look at what happens when you sign Tre'Quan Smith, what happens there is that you solidify the bottom of your depth chart, right? The guys that are going to compete, the guys that are going to be in the mix for roster spots. That's what that does. It's not with the intent of, he's the number 2 wide receiver now, all the problems are there. It was kind of like when Daniel Sorensen was signed last week. Daniel Sorensen is more of a Jeff Heath replacement than he is a, Marcus Williams replacement or a potential Malcolm Jenkins replacement, depending upon what happens with Malcolm Jenkins this offseason. That's not what Daniel Sorensen was signed for. Daniel Sorensen was signed to play special teams, and that's what he might play if he makes the roster. The difference here is Tre'Quan Smith will make the roster based upon the amount of money that they've given him, the incentives and all that, but it doesn't mean that he sits atop the roster, right? Just because you sign somebody doesn't mean that they sit atop your roster. They get in the mix. Now to get in the mix a little bit further, we have to look at the NFL draft, I think, when it comes to trying to identify wide receivers and talent that the New Orleans Saints can benefit off of this offseason. The draft and undrafted free agency are pretty much what's coming up next for New Orleans, about a month away from the NFL draft. So let's look at the first 4 picks for the New Orleans Saints. We'll start at wide receiver. Then we'll see what happens if we start at O-line. Then we'll see what happens if we start at defensive line and see how you can still check off all the boxes in any case with the first 4 selections of the New Orleans Saints draft in 2022. We got that coming up for you as we wrap up today's Mock Draft Monday episode of Locked On Saints. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a look at 3 4-round mock drafts, which gives us an opportunity to look at the top 5 picks that the New Orleans Saints would have in the 2022 NFL draft. And I kind of just wanted to do 3 different mocks, talk through them briefly, but the idea being to start at different positions in each one. And we know where the New Orleans Saints love to start their drafts: offensive line, defensive line. They've done it over and over again, particularly since 2006. And that's continued with Jeff Ireland at the helm of the draft classes starting in 2007 and all. And so when I look at sort of what the New Orleans Saints could do in their first 5 selections, first 4 rounds, where they've got 2 third-round picks, it puts them in a position to where, regardless of where they start, they should be able to address whatever it is that they need. And that includes wide receiver, that includes tight end, running back, defensive tackle is a spot where it would certainly make sense for them to invest in the draft. And then, of course, offensive tackle is a potential as well. I only think you go offensive tackle in this year's draft if you're the Saints, though, if like the perfect prospect is there. And that happened with the first mock draft that we'll talk about here. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll try to put them on the screen, maybe up here. I don't know. We'll find out if that works. And so with that, we'll start this one off. So the first pick here at pick 18, this one was easy. Trevor Penning was still on the board. I had to go with Trevor Penning. He's probably the most pro-ready offensive tackle that's going to be available around 18, with the exception of, unless for whatever reason Charles Cross potentially falls. The Locked On NFL draft guys just did a mock draft. He fell to 17, so right there, kind of on the cusp. There was a NFL.com mock draft that did 4 rounds or 3 rounds and 4 picks for the Saints. They're actually really good. I think it was Chad Reuter that did that one. That one actually had Charles Cross falling to 18, so we'll see what actually happens with him. But if Trevor Penning happens to be there at 18, that's really easy. Penning could be just like Charles Cross in the top 10, however. After that, we'll roll wide receiver Christian Watson out of North Dakota State University, tight end Isaiah Likely out of Coastal Carolina, running back James Cook out of Georgia, and then Tennessee defensive tackle Matthew Butler. So that allowed us to go offensive tackle, wide receiver, tight end, running back, and then defensive tackle in this one. So getting Christian Watson at 49 was an absolute steal. And I'm sorry, but in any iteration, even if it means having to trade up in the second round, for instance, or even trade up in the first round, walking away after 2 selections with Trevor Penning and Christian Watson, done. Shut down the draft. You're good. You've done a good job. But then I was able to come back around and get a really, really athletic tight end like Isaiah Likely. Oh, just to talk about Christian Watson again real quick. If Marquez Valdes-Scantling was the prototype that the Saints were looking for at wide receiver to operate opposite Michael Thomas in a very, very sort of defined downfield threat role, Christian Watson is the draft prospect that is most like Marquez Valdes-Scantling. They're both 6'4". They're both 200 plus pounds. They both got 4.3 speed, 4.36, 4.37 for both of them. So Christian Watson just makes a ton of sense there. Then you roll around with another pass catcher, another really good and athletic pass catcher in tight end Isaiah Likely, who can get some of the dirty work done as a blocker, as well as can running back James Cook. Very good pass protector out of the backfield, but can also catch some passes out of the backfield, can also be trusted as a runner. Just a really good versatile piece that you can use a bunch of different ways, either in place of Alvin Kamara or in concert with Alvin Kamara. And in Matthew Butler, defensive tackle from Tennessee, we know that Tennessee defensive tackles, or really Tennessee prospects, but particularly Tennessee defensive players, have been hugely prioritized in, let's say, priority free agency and such. And so I think that, with Dennis Allen, with Jeff Ireland still being those guys in the room, that makes a lot of sense that a guy like Matthew Butler could potentially end up on the New Orleans Saints in the 4th round as a defensive tackle that can play anywhere from nose tackle to 5-tech and can make plays in the run game, can make plays in the passing game, and can do things in 1-gap and 2-gap situations, moves really well laterally in the run game as well. So he just checks a lot of boxes for you. Okay, let's look at the next draft here. So this one, we'll start off with wide receiver. Wide receiver Chris Olave out of Ohio State, Travis Jones, defensive tackle out of UConn, and then Carson Strong, the quarterback out of Nevada, as well as Wan'Dale Robinson at wide receiver out of Kentucky, so doubling up at wide receiver there, and then Dameon Pierce, running back out of Florida. So Chris Olave, you know him, you love him. The Saints sent a full contingent to Ohio State's pro day. Got to look at both Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, so that at least they're on their radar, former Buckeyes, everything like that also works. Travis Jones, defensive tackle, again, somebody that can give you good run stopping, but that can also get some pressure on the quarterback, has a little bit of explosion, maybe not as much as you'd like to see at the position, but you can certainly help him get there, particularly with the development process that we've already seen from a guy like Ryan Nielsen. Going quarterback here, Carson Strong, he was just the best player available on the board, and I thought, all right, well, if I'm going to take a flyer at a quarterback at some point, this seems to be the place that makes the most sense. Out of these 3 drafts, you've got the wide receiver already, you've got the defensive tackle already, Ohio tackle. Offensive tackle, not as big of a need, knowing that you've got James Hurst. And then there weren't really any wide receivers on the board at that point that I really felt like investing in at the beginning of at that first pick in the 3rd round. And I just picked 2 picks later. So if a wide receiver that I liked was still there, then I could go with that. But let me go with the quarterback here and see if you get somebody that, you put the back. Yeah, like Ian Book's still on the roster. Blake Bortles is still on the roster. But is Ian Book Dennis Allen's guy, or was he Sean Payton's guy? And does Dennis Allen like a guy like Carson Strong, who feels a little bit like, but maybe with a bigger arm, Derek Carr? So it could be an interesting, just kind of project there. It's a 3rd round pick, who cares? And then 2 picks later, Wan'Dale Robinson was still there, so I picked him up. He's a run after catch threat. He is much smaller than what the New Orleans Saints usual prototype is, but maybe they don't care as much about the prototype. And then Dameon Pierce, running back out of Florida, great pass protector, and again, somebody that can do a little bit of everything out the backfield. Okay, last one. Start off with defensive tackle in this one. We know the Saints love starting off on the defensive line in the defensive trenches to start off drafts, so might as well take a look at one of those. But with Devontae Wyatt out of Georgia, he was still on the board here at 18, so that was an easy selection there. I'm going to be honest. Jordan Davis was still on the board here too, but I just thought that Devontae Wyatt's fit makes a little bit more sense. Jordan Davis is really athletic and all that, but he's a nose tackle for you. I don't know that that's necessarily what the Saints are looking for. I think they're looking for more of a penetrating, pass rushing 3-tech. So Wyatt fits that mold for me a little bit better. Then I was able to roll next with, I want to make sure that I don't mispronounce this, Daniel Falele, the offensive tackle out of Minnesota. He's big, y'all. He is a monstrosity, 6'8", 300 plus pounds, of course, but has some really, really good athleticism, great lead blocker, does a good job pulling, getting to the second level, all that. So definitely an offensive tackle worth looking at there. Then I wanted to go with the quintessential Z receiver, kind of like what we saw in a guy like, Amar Smith-Marset a few years ago. Now we have Khalil Shakir. I wanted to say Shakur, like Tupac, wide receiver out of Boise State. He's a field stretcher. He's got pretty good speed. He's going to be somebody that's going to be a quintessential Z receiver. You can use him out of the slot as well, but I think you've got enough rotation at the slot in New Orleans between Tre'Quan Smith, Marquez Callaway, and Deontay Hardy that Khalil Shakir would give you somebody over on the outside. Then I went with Greg Dulcich, the tight end out of UCLA, followed by Velus Jones Jr., the wide receiver out of Tennessee. Greg Dulcich, very easy. Again, another really, really athletic piece that I think would be fun to add to the offense. And then also Velus Jones Jr., he's got great speed. He's in the 4.3 area. He gives you that speed that I really liked with Christian Watson. Doesn't give you the same size, but he has a little bit of a connection here already with Cody Burns. So that would make a ton of sense there as well. So okay, 3 quick 4-round mock drafts to make sure you kind of get an idea of how boards can fall depending upon who invests at what point, and how the New Orleans Saints can really check a lot of boxes no matter where they go in the first round, because there's a lot of deep draft classes here that they will be able to take advantage of at positions that really need those impact players, wide receiver, quarterback, otherwise. So if you like one of those, let me know. If you want to submit your own mock draft, you can always do that by hitting me up on Twitter at Ross Jackson Nola as well. Coming up tomorrow, let's get started with our position by position look through of the NFL draft. We'll start off with wide receiver, and we'll go literally rounds 1 through 7 and take a look at one wide receiver in each round that the Saints could potentially invest in. We'll do that for wide receiver, offensive tackle, defensive tackle, and all the positions of need as we get closer and closer to the NFL draft just a month away. Thank you as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out for your second listen of the day, the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. Got everything that you need. Eric Crocker, Ryan Tracy, everything you need. They got your mock draft Monday up, all that. So go and check them out wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube as well. As always, y'all, I appreciate you so much for making me a part of your day and a part of your routine. If for everything in between these episodes here on Locked On Saints, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, Nola. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.